You used to watch your father pull two crumpled dollar bills from his shirt pocket on Friday, and you knew that was supper for 5 until Monday morning. So you learned to slice a single can of Spam thin enough to cover a whole skillet, because your mother taught you that thin meat looked like more meat. Number 19 on this list was invented on a steel mill paycheck in 1932. Number 4 sold 100 million cracker boxes in 3 years. Number 11 on this list turned a glass of water into a slice of pie. These 25 dinners were not cheap food. They were ingenious survival engineering, built by women feeding 6 on a furnished store credit slip and men stretching 1 paycheck across a recession. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the rest. Here are the 25 genius poor man's dinners that will change how you cook forever. Number 25, Hoover stew. You learned this one in a soup line in 1932 because they were the only kitchen still cooking. A pot of macaroni, a can of stewed tomatoes, a can of corn, and whatever hot dogs the butcher could not sell that week. They named it after the president who took the blame, and Hooverville families ate it 3 nights a week for a decade. And the trick was the order. You cooked the macaroni first, drained most of the liquid, then dropped the tomatoes and corn into the same pot so the pasta starch thickened the broth without flour. 1 pot, 1 burner, 20 minutes total. The whole pan cost 20 cents in 1933 and fed 5. But a single mother in a Hooverville tent could put a hot supper on a folding table with 2 cans, 1 box of macaroni, and a stove that ran on scrap wood. Your grandmother called it supper. She was not ashamed. Number 24, Depression spaghetti. You opened a bottle of ketchup and you opened a box of pasta, and that was the entire grocery list. The home cooks of the 1930s figured out that sugar, vinegar, and tomato puree were the 3 things that made marinara taste like marinara, and ketchup already had all 3. You boiled the noodles, drained them, stirred in half a bottle of ketchup, and you had a plate that looked like Italian food on a budget that did not. A Japanese chef in 1945 watched American GIs eat C-ration spaghetti and invented Neapolitan, still on Tokyo menus today. Down in Haiti, they make breakfast spaghetti with ketchup, sausage, and pepper. 1 cheap idea, 3 countries, all feeding workers. The bare-bones version fed millions across 2 decades. Number 23, tomato soup cake. You measured a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup straight into the mixing bowl, and you got a spice cake out of the oven that nobody could place. The recipe showed up in community cookbooks around 1928, when eggs and milk were too expensive, and the soup did the work of dairy. The cake came out moist and dense, with a cinnamon and clove crumb that tasted like a campfire spice cake. Campbell's started printing the recipe on the soup label in 1960. Your great-aunt frosted it with cream cheese, served it on a Sunday plate, and let your uncle ask 3 times what kind of cake it was. She never told. The tomato acid activated the baking soda and gave the cake a tight crumb you cannot get with milk. The genius was always the sleight of hand. Nobody at the table knew they were eating a soup can. Number 22, mock apple pie from Ritz crackers. You broke up 36 Ritz crackers into a pie shell, poured a sugar syrup of water, sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar over the top, dusted it with cinnamon, and baked it for 30 minutes. What came out tasted enough like apple pie that grown men asked for seconds. Ritz hit shelves on November 21, 1934, at 19 cents a pound, and within 3 years they were the best-selling cracker in the world. Apples were expensive, crackers were cheap. The cream of tartar mimicked apple's tart bite, and the lemon did the rest. By the Second World War, Nabisco was printing the recipe on every blue cracker box. Your grandmother served it at church suppers. Nobody guessed, but you could only pull it off if you served it warm. Cold mock apple pie tasted like a soggy cracker, and that was the rule every Depression-era hostess passed down without writing it on the recipe card. Number 21. Hamburger gravy on toast. You browned half a pound of ground beef in cast iron, sprinkled 3 tablespoons of flour into the grease, stirred a minute, then poured in 2 cups of milk and thickened it. You poured the gray, peppery gravy over toast. 30 cents fed 4 in 1962. The Navy called it SOS for short, which stood for two words your grandmother would not say out loud. The dish first appeared in the 1910 Manual for Army Cooks and fed soldiers from World War I through Vietnam. The trick is, the flour cooks in the beef fat for a full minute before the milk goes in. That kills the raw taste. Your father did it without thinking. What most people miss is that the bread mattered as much as the gravy. White toast was wrong. You wanted Wonder Bread 3 days stale because the dry crumbs soaked the gravy without going to mush. Number 20. Tuna noodle casserole. You opened a can of chicken of the sea, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, boiled egg noodles, mixed it with a cup of milk, topped it with crushed potato chips, and broiled it 10 minutes. The first printed recipe came out of Sunset magazine in 1930 from a Kennewick, Washington woman named only as Mrs. WFS. Campbell's introduced cream of mushroom soup in 1934, and that one product is the reason your grandmother made this every Thursday for 31 years. By 1959, 8 out of 10 households served canned tuna weekly, with this casserole in the top 3 uses. It fed a working family of 5 for less than $1. It still does. Your aunt is still making it. The genius detail was the potato chip crust on top, which turned to glass under the broiler and shattered when you ran the spoon through the dish. The crunch is what your cousins remembered, not the tuna, the chips. Number 19. American chop suey. You browned a pound of ground beef with a chopped onion, added a can of tomato sauce and a can of stewed tomatoes, stirred in 2 cups of cooked elbow macaroni, and called it dinner. New England called it chop suey. Michigan called it goulash. In Pittsburgh, your father called it Tuesday. The earliest printed recipe goes back to 1909. The version your grandmother knew came from a 1958 cookbook that added bacon and green peppers and stretched the pan to 6 people. But that is the working definition of genius: cheap, filling, shameless. And the real engineering inside the bowl was the elbow macaroni itself, because the curl of the noodle held a tablespoon of tomato sauce on its own, which meant a single spoonful delivered 3 things at once: the meat, the starch, and the sauce. Number 18. Spam fried in a cast iron skillet. You opened the can with the pull tab, slid the pink loaf onto the board, sliced it 8 times against the grain, and laid the slices in a hot, dry skillet. Hormel introduced Spam in 1937 to move pork shoulder that nobody was buying. The 1940 Hormel cookbook listed 50 ways to cook it. By the end of World War II, the United States military had received over 150 million pounds of Spam, and every soldier coming home had an opinion. Some men hated it. Most kept eating it on a Sunday morning for life because it was the cheapest hot meat in the store and lasted on a shelf 2 years. Your grandfather fried it in lard with eggs and never apologized. The sugar and sodium nitrite in the Hormel recipe gave the surface a dark caramel crust on cast iron. A single 12-ounce can sliced 8 ways fed 3, but you had to slice it thin. Thin meat looked like more meat. Number 17. Pasta and peas. You diced a potato, diced half an onion, fried them in olive oil until soft, dumped in a can of peas with its liquid, added water to cook a half pound of rigatoni. A woman named Clara Canucciari grew up eating it in upstate New York during the Depression and made it famous on YouTube at age 91 before she passed at 98. She said pasta was the crutch her family leaned on when there was no meat for the table, no money for the rent, and no light at the end of the calendar. The potato thickens the broth, the pea liquid salts the sauce, the pasta holds on to everything. 40 cents in 1934. $2 and change today. Cheaper than fast food? Better than fast food. Clara cooked the pasta directly in the pea water because the starch and the canning salt built a glossy sauce without butter. She made it the way her grandmother had on a wood stove. Number 16. Milk toast. You toasted 2 slices of stale white bread, dropped them in a wide bowl, heated a cup of milk just below a simmer, melted butter and sugar on the toast, then poured the hot milk over with a sprinkle of nutmeg. That was supper on a sick night in 1934. That was breakfast on a cold morning in 1947. Mark Twain ate it. Every grandmother in the Midwest made it for a child with a fever or a husband worn out from the late shift. The bread softened just enough to hold a spoon. The milk turned sweet from the butter melting under it. It cost less than a nickel a bowl. The genius was the staling. Day-old bread held the shape of a slice under hot milk. Fresh bread fell apart inside 90 seconds. Your grandmother set aside the heel of every loaf for milk toast, and that was how a kitchen wasted nothing across a generation. It still tastes like being loved. Number 15. Water pie. You whisked a cup and a half of water, a cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of vanilla, 4 tablespoons of flour, and 4 pats of butter, then poured the lot into an unbaked shell. The first printed recipe ran in California in 1886, but the dish came back during the Depression when cooks had no eggs, no milk, and no excuse to skip dessert. The flour and the sugar set the water into a gelatinous custard in the oven, the butter floated to the top in beads of yellow, and the whole thing sliced clean once it cooled. Your great-grandmother served it at a wake in 1934 in West Virginia. Nobody knew it was made of water. They asked her for the recipe. She just smiled and lied. The chemistry is sugar binding water into syrup, then flour, gelating it into a sliceable solid past 200 degrees. You do not need to know any of that to bake one. You just need to trust the oven for 45 minutes and walk away. Number 14. Vinegar pie. You stirred half a cup of white vinegar into hot water, added a cup of sugar, 2 beaten eggs, 3 tablespoons of flour, a pat of butter, and a pinch of nutmeg. What came out of the oven tasted like a lemon meringue pie that had never seen a lemon. Vinegar pie traveled on wagon trains from Tennessee to Oregon and fed Laura Ingalls Wilder's family on the Dakota Prairie. The acid bit. The sugar covered it. The custard set in 25 minutes at 350. Your great-grandmother called it desperation pie. She made it on a Sunday when the preacher was coming. He asked for 2 slices, and the genius was the temperature of the water before the vinegar went in. The hot water dissolved the sugar all the way through, and only then did the cold acid hit, which kept the egg from scrambling on contact and gave the custard its silky texture. She brought the kettle to a near boil before she started. Number 13. Poor man's meal of hot dogs and potatoes. You diced 4 potatoes, fried them in bacon grease until brown, threw in half a chopped onion, then sliced 4 hot dogs into coins for the last 6 minutes. Salt, pepper, a glug of ketchup on the side of the plate. That was supper in a coal camp in 1937, in a Bakersfield trailer in 1981, and in a kitchen in Ohio tonight. The dish has no recipe card. It is the working family's reflex meal, the one a man cooks when his wife is at the late shift. It costs about $3 to make today. It costs nothing to remember. Both are true at once. The order matters more than the recipe. Potatoes first, all the way to a deep brown crust, then the onion for sweetness, and the hot dogs only at the very end so the casing split and rendered their own fat into the pan. Number 12. Hoe cakes with sorghum. You whisked a cup of cornmeal, half a cup of buttermilk, a beaten egg, salt, and a tablespoon of bacon grease, and spooned it into hot cast iron in palm-sized rounds. The name comes from the iron blade of a garden hoe, which freed slaves and sharecroppers used as a griddle over an open fire when there was no proper pan in the cabin. The Cherokee taught it to the colonists. Black families in South Carolina made hoe cakes a quiet act of survival through the Jim Crow century. You eat them with sorghum poured straight on top. They cost pennies. They are, by every honest measure, ancestral food. The genius was the bacon grease in the batter itself. A tablespoon of rendered fat made the hoe cakes brown the way a real pancake brown does, and the salt from the cured pork seasoned the corn from the inside. Without the grease, the cakes were chalky. With it, they tasted like the breakfast stove. Number 11. Cornmeal mush fried in lard. You stirred a cup of yellow cornmeal into 4 cups of boiling salted water, cooked it 15 minutes until it pulled from the sides, poured it into a loaf pan, and cooled it overnight in the icebox. The next morning, you sliced it half an inch thick, fried the slices in a tablespoon of lard until the outside was a dark mahogany crust, and ate them with butter, sorghum, or a fried egg on top. Your grandfather grew up on this in Pennsylvania Dutch country in the 1920s, and so did half of the Midwest. 1 pound of cornmeal cost 6 cents in 1932 and fed 6 for 2 days. The genius is the pause. You cook it once and eat it 3 different ways across 2 days. Fewer dishes, less wood, more meals. And the cooling step was non-negotiable. A warm slab turned to pudding. A cold one held its shape like a Tuscan polenta cake. Number 10. Salmon patties from a can. You opened a 15-ounce can of pink salmon, drained it, mixed in an egg, half a cup of saltine crumbs, a spoon of minced onion, and pepper. You shaped 6 patties, fried them in a 1/4 inch of bacon grease for 3 minutes aside, and you had a Friday supper that fed 5 for less than $1 in 1962. Canned salmon was a backbone of poor American kitchens from 1900 straight through the Carter administration. Catholic families ate it on Fridays. Lutheran families ate it because it was cheaper than chicken. Your grandmother served it with a slice of lemon and a dollop of mayonnaise mixed with sweet pickle relish. She called it a tartar sauce. It worked, and the bones were the secret. The soft little vertebrae in a can of pink salmon are pure calcium, mashed straight into the patty by your grandmother's fork. A single can delivered more calcium than 2 glasses of milk, which is why Depression-era doctors recommended it for nursing mothers. Number 9. Bean and bacon soup over crackers. You crumbled 2 strips of bacon into a pot, sweated half a chopped onion in the fat, added 2 cans of navy beans with liquid, a can of tomato sauce, 3 cups of water, salt, pepper, and a bay leaf, and simmered 45 minutes. You served it in a bowl over a handful of crushed saltines. Campbell's started selling bean and bacon soup in a red and white can in 1908, and by the worst years of the Depression, it was the cheapest hot calorie a family could buy at the grocery counter. 11 cents a can. It fed 3 people. The crackers were the second meal hiding inside the first one because they thickened the broth into something that ate like a stew. Your father drank the last spoonful straight from the bowl. Your mother never said a word. The genius was the math. A sleeve of saltines cost a nickel and stretched the soup into 2 suppers because the broth that would have evaporated was bound by the cracker starch. Number 8. Liver and onions with brown gravy. You sliced a pound of beef liver, dredged it in seasoned flour, and fried it in bacon grease 2 minutes aside. You pulled the liver out, cooked 2 sliced onions in the same pan until they were dark and sweet, then poured a cup of beef broth in to scrape up the brown bits and thicken the gravy with the leftover flour on the meat. Liver was the cheapest cut at the butcher counter for 65 years. It is full of iron and B12, which is why Depression-era doctors prescribed it for tired mothers and growing children. You ate it because it was free or close to it. You remember it because your grandmother soaked it in milk for an hour first, and that is the trick that made it tender. The second trick was the heat. You never cooked liver past medium. More than 2 minutes aside and it turned to leather. Pink in the middle, crisp outside, under dark, sweet onions. Number 7. Cabbage and noodle skillet. You shredded half a head of green cabbage, chopped 1 onion, melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a wide skillet, and cooked it slowly 25 minutes until the pan turned a sweet brown. You boiled half a pound of egg noodles separately, drained them, dumped them into the cabbage, salted heavily, peppered heavily, and ate it straight from the skillet. The dish came from Polish, Hungarian, and Slovak grandmothers who landed in western Pennsylvania between 1880 and 1925. A head of cabbage cost a nickel in 1934. It still costs less than $2. The cabbage is what a Johnstown family ate when the mill shut down in 1977. It still works. The heat had to stay low for the full 25 minutes. A hot pan turned the cabbage gray and sour. A patient pan caramelized the leaves and coated the noodles in a sweet, nutty glaze. Number 6. Fried bologna sandwich for supper. You laid a slice of Oscar Mayer bologna in a hot, dry skillet, cut 4 shallow slits around the edge so it would not curl, and fried it 90 seconds aside until the surface was a dark, blistered brown. You slid it onto soft white bread with yellow mustard. That was supper for a coal miner in Harlan County in 1955 and a single mother in Akron in 1981. Bologna was the cheapest meat in the deli case from the war through the 1979 recession. 29 cents a pound in 1968, 69 cents a pound in 1980. Your grandfather called it Kentucky steak. He was not joking, and he was not ashamed. He worked 38 years underground. The slits in the edge were the engineering most people miss. Without them, the bologna ballooned in the middle, and the edges burnt black before the center got hot. With them, the slice stayed flat, and the surface caramelized like a thin steak. Number 5. Peanut butter and onion sandwich. You spread 2 tablespoons of peanut butter on white bread, laid 4 thin rings of raw yellow onion across the peanut butter, sprinkled salt, and pressed a second slice on top. James Beard wrote about this sandwich. So did a generation of Depression-era columnists who needed cheap protein and an onion's flavor punch to stretch a school lunch. The sweet peanut butter and the sharp onion balance inside one mouthful, and the salt makes the bread taste like more bread. 5 cents in 1934. A buck and change today. Your great-grandfather ate one a day for 2 years during the worst stretch of his working life, and his blood pressure was the envy of his doctor. He was still eating them in 1978. The onion had to be sliced paper thin, raw, and yellow. A red onion was too sweet. A green onion did not bite. A thick slice of yellow onion overpowered the peanut butter and turned the sandwich into a dare. Thin rings on a sharp knife, 4 to a sandwich. Number 4. Biscuits and sausage gravy. You browned a half pound of pork sausage, crumbled it fine, sprinkled 3 tablespoons of flour over the meat, stirred a full minute, then poured in 2½ cups of whole milk and thickened the gravy with a heavy crank of black pepper. You split 4 buttermilk biscuits, ladled the white gravy over the top, and served it for breakfast or supper or whatever meal needed feeding. The dish was born in late 1800s Appalachian logging camps where men needed 2,000 calories before sunrise. It traveled to every truck stop and every diner in the country, and it still costs less than $4 to feed a family of 4. The pepper is not optional. The pepper is the entire point. You will taste it for an hour after the plate is gone. The biscuit is the second engineering. A flaky biscuit fell apart. A drop biscuit, denser, made with cold buttermilk, held its shape under a full ladle. Number 3. Ham hock and pinto beans. You rinsed a pound of dry pintos, soaked them overnight, and dropped them in a heavy pot with a smoked ham hock, a chopped onion, 2 garlic cloves, and 10 cups of water. You simmered 3 hours over low flame until the beans broke into a mahogany broth and the meat fell off the bone in soft, salty pieces. You served it in a bowl with a square of cornbread on the side and a splash of pepper vinegar on top. $3 feeds 8 people. The ham hock was usually free from the butcher because nobody else wanted it. The genius is the bone. The bone gives the broth its fat, its salt, and its body. You cannot fake it. You can only wait for it. The overnight soak was the thing nobody had to teach. Beans in cold water at bedtime were a quiet promise that supper was already half-cooked. Number 2. Creamed peas on toast. You melted 3 tablespoons of butter, whisked in 3 tablespoons of flour for a full minute, poured in a cup and a half of whole milk, and stirred until the sauce coated a wooden spoon. You folded in a can of Le Sueur baby peas with the liquid, salted heavily, and ladled the green and white mix over buttered toast. That was Tuesday supper in an Illinois parsonage in 1944, when the meat ration was spent. That was Thursday supper in an Iowa farmhouse in 1965, when the harvest money had not come in. 25 cents in 1944, $1.50 today. Your grandmother served it with a glass of cold milk and a slice of pickled beet on the side. She did not apologize, and you did not ask her to. The canning liquid in the Le Sueur can was the part most modern recipes throw away, and they should not. The juice was already salted, lightly sweetened, full of pea starch, and it thickened the bechamel from the inside. Number 1. Mock duck from sausage and bread. You browned a pound of ground pork sausage in a skillet with a chopped onion and a chopped stalk of celery, drained the fat, and stirred the meat into 4 cups of dry bread cubes with a beaten egg, a teaspoon of sage, salt, and pepper, plus enough warm chicken broth to bind the lot. You patted the stuffing into a loaf shape on a baking sheet, basted it with a tablespoon of bacon grease, and baked it at 375 degrees for 40 minutes until the outside was a dark brown crust. The dish came from Wisconsin and Minnesota farm kitchens in the 1930s, when a real duck was 3 days of paychecks. The genius is the sage. The sage smells like duck. The sage tastes like duck. The sage was already in the spice tin from the year before, free. By the time the loaf hit the table on a Sunday in 1934, your grandfather had carved it the way he would have carved a real Sunday bird, slowly, against the grain, 3 slices at a time. He spooned pan drippings on each slice like a real gravy. Every adult at the table played along, because pretending the loaf was a duck was the small kindness that made the meal feel like a holiday instead of a hardship. What most people miss about poor man's cooking is sitting right there on the plate, which is that survival was the mother of the best food this country ever made. Your aunt laid the good cloth. Your mother lit the long taper. Your father said grace and named the bird out loud, slow, so the children would believe. The recipes did not survive because they were cheap. They survived because they tasted like a family that refused to stop celebrating. Cornmeal drop dumplings in broth were a warm meal born from desperation and a little genius. When meat was scarce and soup looked too thin, a quick cornmeal batter could save dinner. You'd mix cornmeal with water or milk, pinch off little balls, and drop them into bubbling broth to puff and soak up the flavor. They came out soft, dense, and delicious, tiny golden pillows floating in the pot. The smell of simmering broth filled the house, carrying a quiet promise that everyone would eat tonight. It was the kind of recipe that stretched the smallest pot of soup into something that could feed a family. Some added onions or pepper, others just relied on the broth to do the heavy lifting. Either way, it worked. Cornmeal drop dumplings didn't just fill bellies, they lifted spirits. They were proof that a handful of meal and water could turn hunger into gratitude. Shepherd's pie was the meal of second chances. You took yesterday's meat, mixed it with whatever vegetables you had, canned peas, frozen corn, even just onions, and laid it down like the foundation of something better. Then you spread mashed potatoes on top like frosting, soft and thick and hopeful. Into the oven it went, and out came something that looked and smelled like you tried. It was the art of disguise. Leftovers turned into something new. Scraps turned into comfort. You scooped it out with a spoon, the layers blending together in a hot, savory mess that never looked perfect, but always felt right. It made the table feel full, even when the fridge was empty. And sometimes that illusion was all you needed to keep going. Shepherd's pie reminded you that with enough heat and time, even the broken pieces could come together. Pea and egg salad plate was a thrifty supper that turned humble staples into a refreshing main dish for a warm evening. Canned peas were drained and chilled before being folded with chopped hard-boiled eggs, diced celery, and a splash of mild vinegar dressing. A pinch of dry mustard or a spoon of mayonnaise added just enough richness to bind everything together while still keeping the cost low. Served on crisp lettuce leaves or alongside sliced tomatoes from the backyard garden, it provided protein and texture without any need for meat. Home cooks loved how quickly it came together using pantry items that were inexpensive and easy to find year-round. Children enjoyed the gentle sweetness of the peas, while adults appreciated the subtle tang from the dressing. This simple combination was light enough for summertime, but filling enough to carry a family through a busy evening, reflecting the practical yet creative spirit of mid-century kitchens, where canned vegetables and eggs formed the backbone of many dependable weeknight meals. Rutabaga hash was a clever dish that made the most of rutabagas, which were cheaper and more plentiful than potatoes during the Depression. Families would chop the firm root into small cubes, frying it with onions and whatever fat they could find. The rutabaga softened and browned, giving a texture and taste that mimicked potatoes closely enough to satisfy hungry families. Sometimes scraps of bacon or ham were added for flavor, but more often it was just the vegetables alone. The hash was hearty, filling, and adaptable, often appearing at both breakfast and dinner tables. Since rutabagas grew well in harsh conditions, they were dependable crops when potatoes ran short. Many children grew up not realizing their parents had been serving them substitutes, because the crispy fried cubes tasted so much like the real thing. Rutabaga hash showed how families made necessity feel normal, turning cheap vegetables into meals that could carry them through some of the hardest years in memory. Bologna and apple skillet combined two humble ingredients in a sweet and savory partnership that captured the playful side of 1960s home cooking. Slices of bologna were quickly browned in a cast iron skillet, then tossed with diced apples and a small knob of butter until the fruit softened and released its natural juices. The salty meat and gently sweet apples created a flavor that felt surprisingly rich despite the low cost. This dish made excellent use of ingredients that were almost always on hand: inexpensive deli meat and seasonal fruit. Families appreciated its speed on busy weeknights, while children were drawn to the fun contrast of tastes and textures. Served over toast or alongside mashed potatoes, it became a complete meal that proved resourceful cooks could create memorable flavors from the simplest pantry staples. Decades later, it remains a reminder of how imaginative combinations could turn everyday items into an unexpected treat without straining a modest household budget or requiring elaborate preparation. Beans and cornbread was the gospel of the broke South. Pinto beans soaked overnight, slow-cooked all day, and served steaming hot with a thick slice of cornbread. This was not just dinner. This was survival seasoned with tradition. The beans were soft and earthy, flavored with salt, onions, or maybe a ham hock if someone blessed you. The cornbread was crumbly and golden, sometimes sweet, sometimes not, depending on what part of the country raised you. It was not just a recipe, it was a ritual passed down from someone who learned to stretch a dime into dignity. Even if it was humble, it still brought people to the table like it was a Sunday feast. You broke off chunks and dipped them into the beans like it was communion. And in some ways, it was. Families gathered around it. Conversations started over it. Empty stomachs were quieted by it. It was a meal you could eat for days without getting tired of it because it tasted like home, like history, like someone cared enough to soak the beans instead of rushing a can. And even if they had to rush it, canned beans and boxed cornbread mix, it still counted. It always did. Fried saltines were the unofficial snack of the broke, hungry, and resourceful. Crackers were cheap and always around, and all you needed was a skillet with a bit of oil. You'd toss in a handful of saltines, let them pop and crisp up, then dust them with salt or pepper, or sometimes just eat them plain and hot. The result was something so simple it almost felt like a secret. The crunch was addictive, the smell buttery even when no butter was used. People made them late at night after long shifts, when dinner had been a memory hours ago. Fried saltines made you feel like you were treating yourself, even though you were just stretching the last crumbs of the pantry. It was survival food disguised as a snack, and it kept more people fed than you'd think. Goulash was not Hungarian, not the kind we grew up with. This was American goulash: elbow macaroni, ground beef, and a tomato sauce that always tasted a little like metal. It was a one-pot meal, no rules, just a way to take cheap ingredients and turn them into something that could feed a small army. Some families used onions, others added garlic if they had it. But at its core, it was just meat, pasta, and sauce. And it was enough. You could scoop it out in huge portions and still have leftovers. It reheated well. It was easy to make. And most importantly, it was cheap. Goulash was the dinner you made when you could not afford variety. It was everything in one dish. And it worked. You knew it was going to be a goulash night when the cupboards were getting low and the mood in the house was just a little more tired. But somehow that big pot of steaming pasta made things feel okay. For one night at least. Onion and herb biscuit pie delivered layers of savory aroma and flaky texture while using only basic pantry ingredients. Sliced onions were slowly caramelized with butter and a handful of fresh or dried herbs until sweet and fragrant, then spread in a baking dish and topped with soft biscuit dough. As the pie baked, the onion filling bubbled up and mingled with the biscuits, creating a rich sauce beneath a golden crust. The combination offered a satisfying balance of sweetness from the onions and earthiness from herbs such as thyme or parsley. Because onions were inexpensive and stored well, this recipe quickly became a go-to for frugal households seeking warmth and flavor without expensive meats. It could be served as a vegetarian main dish or as a hearty side for roasted vegetables, making it adaptable to whatever else was on hand. Onion and herb biscuit pie captures the resourceful creativity of mid-century cooks, proving that even the simplest staples can become a centerpiece when treated with care and patience in the oven. Mock fish cakes were a thrifty invention for families who longed for seafood but could not afford it during the Depression. Instead of fish, mashed beans or leftover potatoes were seasoned with onions and herbs, then shaped into patties and fried. When browned in a pan, they resembled fish cakes in both texture and appearance, providing the illusion of a more expensive meal. Families often relied on beans because they were cheap, nutritious, and available through relief programs, making them the perfect base for this dish. Some households even added breadcrumbs or stale crackers to stretch the mixture further. While it might not have carried the same flavor as real fish, it was filling and hearty, which mattered most in those years. For many children, mock fish cakes became a familiar supper, remembered later with a mix of humor and nostalgia. They embodied the era's spirit of improvisation, turning simple, humble ingredients into something that felt like a substitute for luxury. Zucchini tomato layer. Bake turned overflowing summer gardens into a warm and colorful family meal that fit any budget. Thin slices of zucchini were alternated with canned tomatoes inside a buttered casserole dish, sprinkled lightly with breadcrumbs and a handful of grated cheese. As it baked, the vegetables released their juices, blending with the cheese to create a savory sauce that required no extra effort. This dish became a staple during peak harvest months, when zucchini was plentiful and nearly free from backyard gardens or neighborhood swaps. Home cooks appreciated how easily it adapted to what they had on hand, allowing the addition of fresh herbs or a scattering of leftover rice to make it more filling. Served hot with crusty bread, it offered a complete vegetarian supper that satisfied even the most dedicated meat eaters. The simple preparation, bright flavors, and low cost made it a dependable recipe that graced countless 1960s dinner tables, celebrating the abundance of late summer produce while keeping grocery bills comfortably low for hardworking families. Liver and onions were the meal that tested your strength. This was not a dinner kids begged for. It was one you survived. A plate of pan-fried beef liver, dark and dense, smothered in soft, translucent onions that were supposed to make it taste better. The smell alone was enough to make you gag. But liver was cheap, it was full of nutrients, and it was not rationed like other cuts during wartime. So you ate it. You cut tiny pieces and tried to swallow without chewing. You drowned it in ketchup or mustard, anything to make it go down faster. Your parents called it good for you. You called it punishment. But there it was, week after week, staring back at you from a chipped plate, while the onions slid around like ghosts. And if you finished it, you felt like you had won something. You had not. But you felt that way. And sometimes, that was enough. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s answer to fast food when nobody could afford the drive-thru. You'd grab the leftover rice from the night before, toss it into a skillet, and chop up a few hot dogs to throw in. The soy sauce packets saved from cheap takeout finally earned their keep, sizzling as they hit the pan. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen, salty and smoky with a little sweetness from the rice. If you had an egg, you'd crack it right in and stir fast, watching it turn the whole thing golden. If you didn't, no one complained. The hot dogs carried enough flavor to make it feel like a real meal. It looked humble, but it tasted like triumph. Families made it at the end of the week when groceries ran low, and somehow it always hit the spot. It stretched scraps into dinner, turned leftovers into pride, and reminded everyone that creativity was just as filling as wealth. Kids didn't know it was poverty food. To them, it was comfort on a plate. Hot dog fried rice was the flavor of resilience, sizzling proof that even struggle could taste good if you knew how to fry it right. Canned ravioli was the Italian dinner that came in a can and never asked for praise. You popped open the metal lid, poured the heavy red sauce into a pot or a bowl, and microwaved it until it bubbled around the edges. The smell was artificial, the sauce too sweet, and the ravioli too soft, but none of that mattered, because it was food. And sometimes that was the only requirement. Chef Boyardee was not a chef in your kitchen, he was a lifeline, a shortcut to something that felt like a meal even if it came from a shelf instead of a stove. You ate it straight from the bowl, sometimes with a slice of bread to soak up the sauce. Other times, just a fork and a quick prayer that no one noticed how many nights in a row you were eating the same thing. The meat inside the pasta was more memory than substance, a whisper of protein in a sea of tomato. But it was hot, and it was filling, and it kept the stomach quiet when the cupboards were mostly bare. You were not proud of it, but you were grateful, because for $1 or less, it gave you something to hold on to. Peanut butter and celery rice surprised many families with its simple combination of protein and crunch, while staying true to the spirit of economical cooking. Hot-cooked rice was stirred with a generous spoon of peanut butter until it melted into a creamy coating, then finished with finely diced celery for freshness and texture. The nutty flavor provided satisfying richness without the need for meat, while the celery added a pleasant bite that kept each spoonful lively. Children enjoyed the mild sweetness of the peanuts, and parents appreciated how the dish delivered both carbohydrates and protein at a very low cost. It could be served as a warm side dish or as a light vegetarian main course alongside a crisp salad. This inventive recipe reflected the era's openness to global influences and practical experimentation, proving that even unexpected pairings could become a family favorite. Peanut butter and celery rice stands as a delicious reminder of how 1960s cooks stretched their budgets while creating meals that were nourishing, flavorful, and delightfully different. Dandelion coffee was one of the many substitutes that appeared when coffee beans were either unavailable or unaffordable. Families would dig up dandelion roots, roast them carefully until dark, and grind them into a coarse powder. When brewed, the result resembled coffee in both color and aroma, though the flavor carried a bitter earthiness all its own. For those accustomed to real coffee, it was not quite the same, but it became a daily ritual that provided both warmth and comfort in lean times. Children and adults alike drank it, often with a little sugar or milk if available to soften the bitterness. Because dandelions were free and abundant, the drink spread widely in both rural and urban areas. It symbolized the Depression's spirit of using whatever nature offered, even weeds, to replace expensive imports. For many families, dandelion coffee was not just a beverage, but a reminder that comfort could still be found in the simplest, most overlooked places. Velveeta potato bake was the crown jewel of the comfort table in the 1980s, and it didn't take much to make. Just a few peeled and diced potatoes, a splash of milk, and a handful of bright orange Velveeta cubes that melted into creamy gold. The whole dish bubbled and hissed in the oven, turning every corner of the house into a buttery, cheesy paradise. When you opened the oven door, the smell hit first. Rich, warm, and unmistakably fake, but somehow perfect. The top browned slightly while the middle stayed soft and gooey, thick enough to scoop but smooth enough to melt on your tongue. Families brought it to church potlucks and Sunday lunches, always disappearing before anything else on the table. It was the definition of cheap cooking done right, the kind of dish that cost a few dollars but felt like a treat. Kids thought it was fancy, parents knew it was survival. Velveeta potato bake didn't pretend to be healthy or refined. It was comfort in its purest form. It was a casserole made with love and necessity, proof that a block of cheese could turn poverty into pride. Ramen noodles were the dinner of desperation that somehow became a ritual. A block of dried noodles, a packet of salt and spice, and 3 minutes in boiling water. That was it. That was the whole recipe. And yet, it kept showing up in pantries, college dorms, first apartments, and homes where money ran out before the month did. You could dress it up, sure, but no one was fooled. It was hunger food, dressed in hot broth and convenience. And somehow that truth only made it more familiar. You slurped it straight from the bowl, steam burning your face, the broth clinging to your lips. Sometimes you added an egg, sometimes hot sauce, but most times you just made do. The noodles were limp, The broth was salty enough to sting, but it was food, and food meant one more night survived. You did not eat it because you wanted to. You ate it because it was all you could afford, and you learned to love it anyway. Raisin rice. Pilaf proved that a meatless dinner could still feel special and satisfying when handled with care. White rice was simmered slowly with a bit of butter until each grain was tender, then tossed with plump raisins that had been soaked in warm water to bring out their natural sweetness. A pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg added gentle spice, turning plain rice into a fragrant dish that filled the kitchen with an inviting aroma. Many 1960s households served this pilaf as a main course on nights when meat was too expensive, or saved it for church suppers where a simple vegetarian option was welcome. It paired beautifully with a crisp green salad or a side of baked apples, creating a balanced meal from inexpensive ingredients. Leftovers reheated well for breakfast with a drizzle of honey or a splash of milk. The dish showed how a few pantry staples could stretch a grocery budget and proved that even the simplest ingredients could deliver comfort and a hint of elegance at the dinner table. Mock veal loaf delivered the flavor of expensive. Cornmeal dumplings in broth were one of those Depression-era tricks that turned the most modest soup into something that felt like a meal. Flour and wheat were often expensive, but cornmeal remained relatively cheap and widely available. Families would mix cornmeal with water and a little salt to form a simple dough, shaping it into small balls and dropping them into a pot of thin broth. The broth itself could be made from vegetable scraps, meat bones, or even just salted water. But once the dumplings simmered and swelled, the dish felt hearty. Mothers often relied on this trick to stretch a single pot into enough servings for large families. Children loved the dumplings because they had a soft, chewy texture, almost like a treat floating in their soup. Adults valued the filling quality, which helped stave off hunger when no second helpings were possible. Cornmeal dumplings showed the ingenuity of turning something inexpensive and basic into comfort food. In many households, this dish became a staple, remembered later not for its luxury, but for the way it managed to make empty cupboards feel just a little less empty. Oatmeal patties came from mornings when waste was unthinkable and every leftover had a second act. Cold oatmeal from breakfast would be mixed with an egg, maybe some flour, and fried up like pancakes in a sizzling pan. They crisped on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, smelling faintly of cinnamon or whatever sugar you'd stirred in before. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in tight times. You already had it, so why not make it better? You could spread a little syrup on top or just eat it plain, standing at the stove with the spatula still in your hand. Kids didn't complain. They thought it was new, not recycled. Families who grew up poor never forgot oatmeal patties because they represented something special, making the most of what was left. Even when money got better, you'd find people still frying them up out of habit. The golden edges, the smell of butter, the sizzle, it was breakfast reborn. Cornbread and milk was a southern lullaby disguised as dinner. You took day-old cornbread, dry, crumbly, almost stale, and dropped it into a glass of cold milk. No sugar, no spice. Just spoon and memory. It was humble food, the kind you did not question because your grandparents ate it too. Some people used buttermilk, others regular. It depended on what was left in the fridge and how soft you needed the bread to be. You ate it with a spoon, slowly, like it was soup. It filled you without asking for attention. It was cheap, simple, and oddly soothing. There was something honest about it, like admitting you had little but making peace with it anyway. In some homes, this was a treat. In others, a last resort. Either way, it kept bellies full and silence at the table. That matters more than most people know. Eggplant Parmesan casserole gave budget-minded families a taste of Italian-inspired comfort without the cost of imported ingredients. Slices of eggplant were lightly breaded, quickly browned in a skillet, and layered with canned tomato sauce, dried oregano, and a modest sprinkle of grated cheese. Baked until the sauce bubbled and the cheese melted, the dish emerged fragrant and hearty, ready to feed a hungry household. Because eggplant was plentiful in late summer and canned tomatoes were available year-round, The recipe fit perfectly into a thrifty meal plan. Many 1960s home cooks discovered it through community cookbooks that encouraged vegetable-centered dinners when meat prices rose. Served with a side of spaghetti or crusty bread, it felt festive enough for company while staying within a modest budget. The mild flavor of the eggplant absorbed the savory sauce beautifully, making each bite satisfying without the need for heavy amounts of cheese or meat. Eggplant Parmesan casserole quickly became a reliable favorite for families eager to stretch their food dollars while still offering something warm and flavorful. Stuffed beet leaves showed how Depression kitchens wasted nothing, not even the leafy tops of common root vegetables. Instead of throwing the greens away, families boiled them briefly to soften and then filled them with small portions of rice, breadcrumbs, or leftover scraps of vegetables. Rolled tightly, they resembled stuffed grape leaves, though much humbler in taste and presentation. Sometimes onions or herbs were added if available, but most of the time they were seasoned simply with salt or vinegar. This dish was especially popular in rural homes where beet crops were plentiful and gardens were a lifeline. Stuffed beet leaves carried a sense of novelty for children who might otherwise turn up their noses at plain greens. Adults valued them for stretching scraps into something that looked and felt more like a real meal. Even in their simplicity, they managed to bring variety to dinner tables that often repeated the same foods day after day. They remain a forgotten reminder of how every single part of a plant had value when survival depended on it. Peanut butter bread pudding was the dessert you made when every sweet thing in the house was gone, but no one wanted to end dinner on an empty note. You'd tear up old bread, pour over a mix of milk, sugar, and a few spoonfuls of peanut butter, then bake until the top turned golden and sticky. The smell filled the house like a warm blanket. It was thick, sweet, and rich enough to make you forget how cheap it was. No one wasted bread back then. It was too precious. If you had bananas or raisins, you could toss those in, but most times it was just bread, milk, and peanut butter working overtime. Families made it in square pans or cast iron skillets, serving it hot with a drizzle of syrup if they were lucky. It wasn't a fancy dessert, but it was one that made you close your eyes with that first bite. Peanut butter bread pudding was poor folks' decadence, a taste of comfort that didn't cost a dime extra. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good. If you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Corncob jelly was one of the most surprising Depression-era creations, turning what was usually discarded into something sweet and useful. After eating or cutting kernels from corn, families would boil the stripped cobs for a long time until the liquid turned golden. With sugar and sometimes pectin, this liquid became a jelly that spread easily on bread or biscuits. It had a mild corn flavor, slightly sweet, and it gave people a way to stretch ingredients without buying fruit for jams. Since sugar was often rationed or expensive, this jelly was seen as a clever way to create a sweet treat out of nothing more than scraps. Many families remembered it fondly, not only because it was thrifty, but because it represented resourcefulness at its finest. Children often spread it on cornbread or stale bread softened in milk, turning waste into dessert. It may seem odd today, but back then it was pure ingenuity. Canned tomato sandwiches were the taste of summer when nothing else was left in the fridge. You'd pop open a can of whole or sliced tomatoes, drain them just enough to stop the bread from falling apart, then slather both slices with mayonnaise. A sprinkle of salt and pepper went on top, maybe a little sugar if you came from the South, and that was lunch done. It was cold, slippery, messy, and perfect all at once. The juice soaked into the bread, softening it until every bite felt like a mix of tang and cream. It wasn't a fancy sandwich, but it was the one that kept bellies full on long, hot afternoons when money ran out before the month did. Some people added lettuce if they had it. Most didn't bother. It was simple, nostalgic, and surprisingly satisfying. The flavor was sharp, honest, and comforting in a way that no processed meal could be. It didn't matter that it came from a can. It still tasted like home. Every bite told a story of resourcefulness and grace. Porcupine meatballs sounded fun, until you realized the only thing spiky about them was the desperation they were made from. These were meatballs born in the hard times, made by mixing ground beef with uncooked rice to stretch every last ounce of protein. They simmered in tomato sauce, and as the rice cooked, it poked out like little white quills. That is where the name came from, someone trying to make poverty sound cute. But if you grew up poor, you know this was not about being clever. It was about making half a pound of ground beef feed a family of 5. They were fragile little things, barely holding together, and often baked in the oven or cooked in a pan until the sauce bubbled up like lava. The tomato sauce was always the cheapest kind, canned, oversalted, and slightly metallic. But it masked the blandness, and that was the goal. Sometimes people added onions or eggs if they had them. Most of the time, it was just the basics: rice, meat, and sauce. Dinner done cheap. If you ever sat at the table with 3 meatballs and a slice of bread, you knew what this meal meant. It was survival with a side of improvisation. Boiled turnip tops were a staple born of necessity, proving that even the green leaves most people might throw away could keep families alive. Turnips were affordable, hardy vegetables that grew well in poor soil, and when their roots were harvested, the greens were never wasted. Women would wash and boil the tops in a simple pot of water, sometimes seasoning only with a pinch of salt if they had it. The greens cooked down into a soft, bitter but nutritious dish that helped fill stomachs when nothing else was available. Occasionally, if there was bacon fat or lard to spare, the leaves would be flavored more richly, but most of the time it was plain boiled greens. Children often disliked the taste, but parents insisted, knowing the vitamins were essential in years when fresh vegetables were rare. For many rural households, boiled turnip tops became a daily food, reminding them of how survival depended on using every single part of the harvest. Apple sausage bread. Pudding married sweet and savory flavors in a way that perfectly captured the experimental spirit of the 1960s kitchen. Day-old bread cubes soaked up a custard of milk and eggs before being mixed with diced apples and small bits of sausage for richness. The dish baked until the top turned golden and the apples released their gentle perfume, filling the home with an inviting scent. By using stale bread and modest amounts of meat, thrifty cooks created a dinner that felt both indulgent and practical. The sweetness of the fruit balanced the smoky sausage, while the custard kept every bite moist. Families often served it with a simple green salad for contrast or a drizzle of maple syrup when they wanted extra sweetness. This recipe highlighted the era's willingness to blend unexpected flavors while keeping costs low. Leftovers reheated beautifully for breakfast the next day, making it a true 2-meal wonder that reflected the frugal yet inventive cooking style of mid-century American households. Biscuit dough pizza boats turned canned biscuits into dinner for a crowd. You'd flatten each one into a little bowl, spoon on tomato sauce from a jar, sprinkle shredded cheese, and maybe add a slice of pepperoni if you were feeling fancy. Pop them in the oven and watch as they puffed and browned, smelling like pizza night on a dime. Kids loved them because they were small enough to hold, and parents loved them because they cost next to nothing. They looked cute, tasted amazing, and disappeared before they even cooled. It was the kind of meal you could make out of leftovers and pantry scraps without needing a recipe card. The 1980s were full of little tricks like this, turning store-brand dough and canned goods into a moment of joy. Biscuit dough pizza boats weren't just food, they were a celebration of what imagination could do on a shoestring budget. Egg salad sandwiches were the soft answer to a hard life. You started with boiled eggs, cheap, filling, easy to store. You mashed them with a fork, added whatever mayonnaise you had, maybe a pinch of salt, a dash of pepper, sometimes even mustard if you were fancy. Then came the white bread, thin and fragile, sticking to the egg like it was doing you a favor. It was cold, quiet food. Not flashy, not warm, not especially comforting. But it filled the space between hunger and dinner. You ate it standing up, over the sink, or wrapped in wax paper at school. There was no crust if someone loved you. There was extra egg if someone loved you more. It was the lunch of the working poor, the dinner of those too tired to cook, and somehow it still managed to taste like home. The eggs were never just eggs. They were patience. They were leftovers. They were something made out of almost nothing. And when the fridge was empty except for a carton and a jar of mayonnaise, you knew what you were having. You did not choose it. You inherited it. These 25 dinners worked because the women and the men who cooked them refused to feed their families anything less than dignity. They stretched a paycheck, a pantry, a winter, a recession. The genius was never in the price. The genius was in the patience. A bone simmered for 3 hours. A loaf cooled overnight. A piece of liver soaked in milk. Tell me in the comments which one of these your grandmother made, and which one you will be making this week. Hit subscribe before you go, because every one of these recipes is still cheap, and every one of them is still on the table somewhere tonight.